Hi everyone. Welcome to our first virtual discussion. It's like an investing series in 2025. We're going to kick off with a deep dive on health tech here in 2025. I'm Yee Mun, MD of Angel Academy, and I'll be hosting this evening. I'm joined by our co-founders, Sarah and Simon, and our network manager, Michelle. In a few minutes, we will be joined by all the cool people on this slide. But first, a quick run through about the hour. So we're going to do a really quick intro to Angel Academy, and then Bob and the rest of the panelists will do intros of themselves. And then we'll start the panel, we'll end with a Q&A, and then I'll close the session. So if you are here, you know that we invest in female founders and we also bring more women onto the angel investing side because it's really, really fun. So like last year, we actually won Angel Team of the Year for our work, and I got to shake Claudia Winkleman's hand. I never knew how tiny she was in real life. We've been doing all of this since 2014. And our angels have backed 52 really cool female-founded businesses and counting. We do our best to support these female founders, even if they don't get investment from the angels. This is done through our really systematic screening process led by Simon and Michelle, as well as our super cool screening committee. And so basically, all the founders who go through the screening process get constructive feedback, which very few angel networks provide. Back of the napkin math suggests that more than 3,000 female founders over the course of our existence have basically been given good feedback or at least constructive feedback about their pitch or their business in one way or another in the past 10 years. So some more numbers for you, but some key highlights. 70% of the network are women. Our diversity number is that we're 30% men. Over the years, we have trained more than 400 women on angel investing, either through our Angel Investing 101 course or in deal teams. We've also, for the businesses themselves, catalyzed more than 150 million in co-investments, which is really, really cool. We wouldn't be able to do all this without our sponsors, Kingsley Napley and DC Advisory, as well as investment partners like Innovate UK, Syndicate Room, Alumni Ventures in the US, and our mission partners. So here is a picture of our portfolio. Generally, this is it, 52 companies. But today, we're going to focus on the 20%. 20% is quite a large number of our portfolio that's focused on health tech. These are the startups, and this is really cool. And so I'm going to pass the virtual mic now to Bob and the panelists who will introduce themselves. Over to you, Bob.
Oh, thank you, Yee Mun. Let's start actually with the panelists. And we've had a technical issue, so I don't know where Dominick has been able to join yet, but let's start with Anne. Could you sort of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Adora?
Yeah, hello. Hi to everyone in the audience. Thanks for joining. I'm Anne O'Neill. I'm the founder and CEO of the Adora digital health platform. So Adora uses AI to personalize the menopause pathway for women. We're clinically led, evidence-based. We're a class 1 medical device. Currently, customers are employers who buy a license for their staff. And in terms of funding, we're one of the 52. So we have some amazing angel investors from Angel Academy and also Cambridge Angels. And our lead investor is Nina Capital, who are a leading health tech VC. So hopefully I can share some useful thoughts and insights from the last 4.5 years of Adora.
That's terrific. Naomi, we're about ready to complete the investment in Movetru, but tell us a bit about that process, which is in which you're still involved in the middle of, and also about what Movetru does.
Yeah, absolutely. So ready to be company 53. So I'm the founder of Movetru. So originally a classical ballet dancer turned engineer turned founder. And Movetru is a wearable for real-time movement quality analysis, which means that we take that subjectivity out of analyzing movement to make better data-driven decisions for athletes and ultimately the general population. And right now, we have our lead investor with documents signed. Angel Academy are going to be coming in on that. So that'll be all wrapped up this month for a £1 million raise to bring Movetru from this R&D phase that we've completed through Innovate UK funding to date, and now bringing us to VC round and be able to accelerate onto commercialization.
Terrific. Dominick, if you could both introduce yourself and HSBC Innovation Banking, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. Hello, everyone. I'm Dominick Kennerson. I'm here in London at HSBC Innovation Banking. HSBC Innovation Banking is the bank that essentially banks startups, scale-ups, and corporates, any kind of business with a high IP kind of a threshold, or that looks like it's venture-backed and kind of fast-moving. So we work with companies quite often that move fast and break things. My role here at the bank, I focus on health tech and health tech companies. I joined the bank 2 years ago, from after I think 9 years with Bayer Pharmaceuticals. So I moved here direct from Berlin, Germany at Bayer, which I think at one point was known as the women's health kind of pharma company, especially with the work that we're doing in contraceptives. Yeah, my work at Bayer, my last role, I focused on corporate venture. So I led a global team doing equity investments and partnerships in women's health, and then a few different areas related to chronic disease management and care.
Thank you very much. And Gillian.
Hi, Bob. My name is Gillian McColgan. I'm an exited entrepreneur in the tech space. Before that, I had 25 years as a CTO in the high-tech world. I basically am an angel investor now, and not quite at the 20% of my portfolio in health tech, but it's running about 15, 16%. So that's me.
And Gillian was actually the co-lead with me on the Movetru investment, and added a bit of hard work expertise as well as some medtech expertise that we desperately needed. So we greatly appreciate her joining Angel Academy. So I'm Bob Mollen. I'm a U.S. lawyer based in London, but these days I spend about 70% of my time mentoring startups across Europe and Israel, and about 40% of that is health tech, med tech. So to launch off, I was asked to provide a definition of digital health, which is a trick question, because there is no definition of digital health. I think we can start with the fact that there's the digital element, which implies that there's some level of computation / analytics. And there's the health element, which indicates that it is sort of med tech, health tech, wellness focused. But that covers a very broad range of stuff that relates to health and wellness. And so one then starts to sort of approach it from a negative standpoint, which is we're not talking about pharma and the actual drugs that are being developed. And we're not talking about biotech, although hold that thought for a moment, because there is some element of that does come into digital health. But once you've sort of eliminated that, and I guess we're not talking about kind of classic kinds of medical device things. We're not talking about stethoscopes. And we're not talking about MRIs or CT machines, even though there's a lot of analytical stuff and digitalization which is associated with them because of their kind of clear hardware status. What does that then leave? It leaves everything from Apple Watches and sensors, which may or may not be medical devices, which an Apple Watch is not. It leads the software that hospitals use or clinics use, both to manage their own activities and to some extent manage things like the surgical pathways or GP pathways or whatever they use. It includes things like platforms for telehealth. It includes patient remote monitoring or elder care monitoring, where someone may be in a home and there may be a device which basically sends an alert if there's been a fall or some other abnormal behavior which suggests that there's a medical problem of some kind. That's a list, but it's only a starting list. And some of those things are regulated medical devices. Some of them are clearly not. Some of them skirt the limits. And so, for example, a diagnostic device which is effectively supports a clinician may not be regulated, but if the diagnosis is actually going directly to the patient, then it is a regulated device. So bottom line is, this is a very messy space. I think that the Angel Academy investments have tended to be toward the things which operate at the patient level rather than, for example, hospital support systems. But even that's a little bit simplistic, because Preactive, for example, which is a prehabilitation for patients to prepare for surgery, is actually will be going to market as part of the surgical pathway. So it is difficult to pinpoint exactly, what's digital health, what's a medical device, etc. Dominick, you remonstrated with me the other day that I was thinking too much on the regulated side and ignoring too much of what in fact is not regulated, or in fact is not subject to kind of reimbursement by healthcare system. Would you like to provide some further thoughts about that?
Yes, thank you, Bob. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Some of these ideas that I was sharing are from a report that we put out earlier this year on UK and Nordic health tech investing trends from last year. So, when we talk about digital health here at the bank, it's typically the label that we apply is kind of health tech. So health technology, essentially. And in that report, when we look at the trends from 2024, the investing trends, where we see value pools and where we see investor FOMO, it's essentially in this layer of companies that interface with consumers, if you will. Or, so for example, I think about a company like a Flow Health, which probably had, from a health tech point of view, had, I think, 158, £1 million fundraise. I think about a company like Aura, which had one of the top 10 fundraisers in health tech last year. There are, I think, a host of other companies. Natural Cycles is one as well. There's also Manual, and so with all of those companies, if I just look at the top 10, all of those companies have a high consumer profile. And to me, I think that's where investors see value. So even if I think about, Manual, for example, we saw Octopus Ventures participate in that round, which, typically you wouldn't see Octopus participate in a company that's probably pushing that later stage, So I think to have them in that round means that they saw a certain kind of value and a certain kind of a growth profile. And I think that kind of plays out in the data. So I think there is a space for, those highly regulated or I shouldn't say regulated, but reimbursement models. But, or even this year, we saw in January, this mega round from a company like Nico Health, right? And so again, you have kind of a clinic model, high kind of a consumer edge to it, provides a primary care kind of an interface. So it is regulated, but it doesn't necessarily rely on reimbursement.
Okay, and I guess we should explain that by reimbursement, what we're really talking about is some kind of third-party payer, like an insurance company, or the NHS, for example, in the UK, or some other party who is paying the cost other than either the consumer or the hospital paying it itself.
Yeah.
Dominick, while we're with you, what did you see? And then I'm going to ask the founders to comment. What have you seen in terms of the funding trends over the last 12 years and the last 12 months, and focusing particularly at early stage, because the kind of things that tend to be pre-Series A for the most part.
Right. Well, I think, so that growth profile I mentioned, because I see the market working in value pools. And so it's a little bit like that adage, well, big banks pay attention to what smaller banks do. And so big investors pay attention, or it's a little bit the reverse, right? So normally those earlier stage investors look at where the value is, like right above them. And those investors look kind of right above them. So I kind of use those models that I mentioned as kind of the North Star for right now. So when we look at the last 12 months, and the way I would categorize those companies would be, and probably where we see the largest trend would be in, and I think to give you some credit when it comes to hospital models, would be in provider operations kind of companies. So companies that kind of provide revenue cycle management support, for example. They are kind of working behind the scenes to make those physician payment and nurse interfaces a bit smoother. Or they are simplifying workflow inside of care settings. So provider operations would be one. And then when I think about like women's health and those kind of consumer models or primary care models, we would typically classify those as alternative care, essentially. So alternative care and provider operations have been probably the top two invested sectors, early stage all the way to late stage for not just the last 12 months, but probably at least the last 2 years, probably going back 36 months or so.
Terrific. And you've had to go through, and then I'll ask Naomi, this whole process of raising funding in this space. I have to say, the whole time I've been involved in this area over a decade, not just in this vertical, but others, it's never been easy. And it certainly isn't easy now, but tell us a little bit about the journey that you had in terms of putting together your early stage investment and where you are at the moment.
Yeah, it isn't easy, that's for sure. So our journey, we bootstrapped. We then joined a VC accelerator called Start Code On in Cambridge. Sorry, I should mention Adora is founded by myself. I have a sort of marketing commercial background, and Ed Smith, who has our CTO, who has a conversational AI background. So we didn't have a health background. So we specifically targeted Start Code On because they worked in the Cambridge ecosystem and were able to introduce us to people in the NHS, to pharma companies, to others other insurance companies, so we could try to understand how to commercialize what we were building. The pain point that we're solving is we're personalizing the menopause pathway for all women. And so it's like, okay, that's great. We had lots of engagement with the product, but who's going to pay for this? And I think that really dominated a lot of the investor conversations that we had. Bob, you said it's a bit messy, this space. It's also a bit new. It's quite nascent. And I think investors themselves, if they don't have a health background, first of all, they're not necessarily always consistent with the milestones they want to see from early stage companies. There isn't necessarily a framework that the investor market agrees on as to traction and milestones for early stage. But then secondly, I think they're not all sure about the commercial model. So who is going to pay for it? And so we've put a lot of work into sort of mapping out the evidence that we need, and then the commercial model as we grow, as we gather more evidence and more proof, who is likely to want to pay for Adora. And our goal is obviously the reimbursements of the NHS and the insurance market. But to sort of go to loop all the way back, it's not very easy. But then, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
Okay, but you've managed effectively to put together your early stage funding, as I understand it, with with a couple of angel groups in particular, and also with is it Nina Capital as your VC lead. When did you last raise, and what was the size of the raise, and what issues did you face in terms of putting that together?
Yeah, so there's kind of two strategies: a non-dilutive funding. So we've Innovate UK winner, and we're funded by the Scottish Government to co-design with the NHS. But then in terms of VC, Nina Capital are our lead investor, and they led our pre-seed round, which was last year. We raised about 650k, and that's when we met Angel Academy, Cambridge Angels, Alumni VC, who are a partner of Angel Academy. And then we've just recently raised a little bit of a bridge round just to accelerate the sales and marketing. What we found in the employer market is the sales cycle is very slow. So we've just closed that, which was good, mostly from our existing investors.
Okay, thank you very much. Naomi, you've managed to get quite late in your process, really largely grant funded, and then now did a smaller angel round, and then this round that you're trying to close. But tell us a little bit more about that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey ultimately started in my master's in product design engineering. So it was meant to be a master's thesis that I went to my graduate role. And at that time, I kind of became obsessed with the problem of injuries. And I felt like if there's a problem in the market, then I should go solve it ultimately. So at that time, it was, can I prove that there's a market? 100 customer discovery interviews later, yes. And I would say that those interviews have kind of fed through every stage of our development now, and continuing to speak with athletes. But next it was, okay, how can we actually prove that the technology will work? And that is where our grants funding came in, because we knew it was difficult technology to develop. We knew there was a lot of hurdles to overcome. And we were fortunate to have Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Fellowship, Innovate UK Women Innovation, Innovate UK Smart Grant, Innovate UK Collaborative R&D Grant, and most recently the European Commission Women in Tech. So all of those meant that we could actually develop the technology, but with that, it meant that we had really little headroom for anything to do with marketing, filing legals, accounts, and our small angel raise meant that we could match fund and also bring it to where it is today. But for this stage, it was proved that there was a market that will actually pay for it. I think is ultimately what we had to show within this raise. And by having a paying customer and also securing a signed contract with another, that was then the push point. Okay, there is a market that they're actually really willing to pay for it. So I feel like on the journey, there was 3 different times: show that there's a problem, and you can do that really without any expense except for time. Solve the technical issue, which was fortunate to be covered in the grants. And then now in the commercialization is for this stage in our VC journey.
Thank you. Gillian, you indicate that 20% of your portfolio about is sort of in the health tech, med tech space. Obviously, you've had to go through a selection process and kind of reach a conclusion as to which of these made sense and which didn't. Can you walk us through a little bit how you approach that, both the kind of initial assessment and the diligence process?
Yeah, so thanks, Bob. I should declare at the start of this that I'm actually an investor in both Movetru and Adora. So they are 2 of my health tech investments. So I guess I come at this from a slightly more comfortable space in that my background is technology. I'm an engineer by training. I spent close to 30 years in high tech. The last 10 of that basically working with intellectual property of one form or another. So that side of it never scares me when I get into looking at what's being pitched. So I come at it from a slightly different place than most people. So where I guess focus most of my time is once I get a sense that whatever's being proposed isn't going to break the laws of physics, I can kind of say, okay, that's a starting point. And then because I'm tech and I've spent most of my career working at the early stages of technology development, I like to be at the very early stages in angel investing. So pretty much all of my investment is done certainly at the SEIS stage. Some of it's EIS. And very often I'm part of the group of first money going in. So at that point, there's really not a lot, as both Anne and Naomi have alluded to. You might have a pitch deck, you might have something that's initial thoughts, you might have some level of UI if it's a Figma graph or something, if it's coming from an app perspective. But really, fundamentally, what you're judging on at that point is the people, the passion, the focus, and whether you can get a gut sense as to whether there's something here that's believable. So in terms of the analytics side of it, I tend to focus very much around do I think there's a market? Do I think they're going at it with a focus that market is viable? Do I think I'm also fairly sanguine that whatever I see in that pitch deck, what's going to emerge 18 months, 2 years down the line as the product is probably not going to look much like what's being pitched. So I'm taking a chance on the founder, and the founding team, which is, do I trust these people? Do I think they've got the focus? Do I think they've got global ambition? Do I think with that global ambition, they've got laser focus in terms of how they're going to get that first customer and first proof points on board? And if all of that's a go, then I kind of look back at the technology a bit and see, do I think there's any moats there? Do I think they're doing something that's unique, differentiated, different, even if it's the business model is different, or how they're approaching the market? And that's kind of where I end up. I've got a fair amount of health tech in the portfolio because actually that's one of the interesting frontiers that people are taking technology that exists in other spaces and sort of moving towards applying that technology to new problems in the tech or the sports space. So that's kind of where I come at it. But when it drills down, it's basically, I like to be what I would think of as front office focused, which is I'm focused on revenue coming in rather than cost and operations reduction. That's a personal choice. It's not because I don't think there's money made elsewhere. It's just that happens to be where my interests are. I'm early stage focused. I'm looking for moats on the technology side. I'm looking for interesting business models. And above all, I'm looking at whether I think I can trust the founders with my money. And am I happy to go on that journey with them, knowing that, it's a portfolio game and ultimately not all will be successful. But if they don't start with that passion, they don't start with the laser focus, they don't start with global ambition, then they're probably not going to succeed anyway. So that's kind of it.
No, that's true. That's a terrific explanation. I think one of the things that tends to scare investors in this space is the National Health Service, and I think many founders that I see start off because they have an impact interest in thinking about the National Health Service, but I think, early reach a conclusion that probably is not an early customer. But I'd like maybe both Anna and you first, and then maybe Naomi. You both have, I think, chosen pathways that avoided that problem, and you spoke about your thinking about the business model and so forth back when you were at Codon. But talk a little bit more about how you've approached that.
Oh, of course, yeah. So, I mean, this all came about because of my lived experience and the impact of the symptoms I experienced, the toll on me, on my earnings. I previously worked in TV and radio, in commercial marketing, in product design. I didn't know the health service at all. So I thought, okay, well, we'll get something designed. We'll talk to 200 women, get a bit of a prototype, go to the NHS, and they'll love it and they'll buy it because I'll talk to the head of procurement in the UK. And I sort of did have that meeting, and they just sort of nodded and said, look, go away and prove it somewhere else. And if you're still here in 7 years, we'll have another chat with you. And that's kind of what we've done. We've gone away to prove it in other markets. Our chosen market is harder than consumer. We've gone straight to employer. There is a market and there are market forces to support that, but we're not giving up on the NHS. Many have. Investors don't always like it, and a lot of investors have been burnt by it. But we have been purposeful about our road to the NHS. We work with the NHS in England and also in Scotland. And that's because of our personal desire to reduce health inequalities for women at this stage in life. So I think from a personal perspective, it's our building this business with purpose that has kept us with the NHS. But from a sort of small startup, being laser focused perspective, it's not always been very easy to carve out exactly the right amount of time to keep that running along. I've got a place on the inaugural NHS Helathtech program in 23, and a lot of people sort of said, really think carefully about whether the NHS is for you. It can be a poison chalice. So our route to the NHS is one proving that this product that we think is excellent and has proven outcomes can be implemented within primary care, and we can save costs. And we're getting amazing results from clinicians who've said this is transformative. So I'm just checking you're still here because my screen just went blank. Sorry. Yeah, you're still here, sorry. And then the other one is we've been funded by the innovative arm of the Scottish Government to work with the NHS, and that's a sort of tailored milestone programme, and we're supported by an awful lot of amazing people on that. So we're very lucky, but it's taken us a long time to get to the point where we have got people who know about us, who want us to be successful. So I would say think very carefully about the NHS if you're just starting off.
I think we have to be a little bit careful because, and I was not in my question, which is, of course, what we're talking about in terms of the negative side of the NHS is the NHS as a customer. The flip side, of course, of the NHS is the NHS as a place to do clinical trials that have global credibility and potentially a place to get access to biobank data and other data which would otherwise be hard to come by. So my question really, it was focused more on the customer side of the National Health Service, but I don't think we should forget the fact that the National Health Service is actually a very useful resource in terms of development. And it sounds like you've gotten some of that, Anna. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have. But I mean, the point about it being the customer is it's a hard customer to crack. It's a hard nut to crack. And you do need evidence, and you do need to prove you're reducing costs. This is for digital health, and that's my lens. And our experience has been positive, but it's a very hard customer to. And despite all of this support, we still haven't got to a contract 4 years in. But the credentials that we get from being part of the pilots and from the Femtech Accelerator have certainly helped us both sell to the employer, helped us with conversations we're having globally, helped us with investors. So that's my point on the NHS as a customer.
And Naomi, you've gone down a very different path in terms of that, although I think we would recognize that at some point the technology that you're developing actually has potential for rehabilitation as well as the kind of use that you're initially putting it to. But talk a bit about the decisions that you made in terms of how to develop the technology and how to go to market.
Absolutely. So I think I can answer with two separate areas. So first, we knew this technology couldn't go straight into the NHS. Like, as a customer, that is not our route to market. We identified that really early on. And because of that, we were looking at who's the early adopters, who needs it the most. And right now for us, it is the sports industry. The sports industry need it the most because it's costing them the most. Whenever you have a multi-million-pound athlete on the field have an ACL rupture, that's costing you every single day. So for them to have their players performing at their best and actually have data-driven decisions, those are the early adopters. Those are the people that need the product the most. So for that reason, sports are who we can start in our market, but ultimately then we achieve our economies of scale, we achieve growth, and then we can bring it into other markets. On the other side, even though we're absolutely not a medical device, we aren't going down that route, but we still want to show that our data is good and valid and against gold standard laboratory analysis. So instead, we went with having the ability to get it validated by Loughborough University, who are the world's leading sports-related university for 8 years in a row. We have a partnership with Manchester Metropolitan University, who are innovation partners with Premier League clubs. Like, we went down a different route, and we also have a partnership then with one of our first customers being a children's hospital within the US, that again, they're going to validate Movetru in North America. So for us, data validation was essential to prove it to our customers long term. Is important in sport as well because the players are so expensive, but also we had to identify that our customer is ultimately the sports market for the next 3 years. And the NHS just would be a long game, and potentially in 10 years we could have a phone call, but that's probably a very different, it's probably not even Movetru having that call in 10 years time.
Okay. Dominick, one of the things that investors worry about in this space is effectively the length of time to exit or time to market, at least in certain elements of it. I think it's not applicable to all elements of it. I have to confess, in my experience, I've seen that some of the other areas like software as a service have turned out to have a lot longer periods to exit than I think investors would have thought about a decade ago. But what's your view in terms of kind of the time that investors who invested early stage in this kind of these areas, are they taking a longer risk in terms of time to exit, and how would you assess that?
Of course, the answer is it depends, right? And I think if I can use the example of Adora, because to be fair, Nina Capital is probably one of the best early stage health tech investors in the world, and I think what's remarkable about what they do, and I've had conversations with their team quite a bit, is they have a thesis built around what they call dragon exits as opposed to a unicorn exit. So essentially, as an early stage fund, a dragon exit is based on a 50 million kind of an exit. So an exit that can completely return the fund. So that's the challenge that Anne O'Neill and her team have ahead of them, essentially. And that's Gillian. Gillian's smiling because she's like, oh yeah, do that. And so, I think the importance is so after a company leaves Angel Academy, whoever is able to support, that pre-Series A round and that Series A round is hugely important. Because that investor is really going to be able to share a thesis, because they have their own bosses, right? That essentially want to see a return, and that's going to drive the fund thesis. And that's essentially what's going to drive or support your exit. I think for healthcare and for health tech in particular, different models and different business models probably have different expectations around exit. So when I hear about a sport model, there's potentially a lower barrier to exit. You alluded to at the top, Bob, you mentioned we're not talking about drug companies, but companies that look maybe what we would call like a tech bio company, right? Like those companies have a different exit profile. Companies that work with large employers like Adora Health, that kind of a company would have a different exit profile. So it's probably category of company. And again, it's that North Star in the market. So part of why we saw those value pools that we did in 2024 and 2023 is because when it comes to creating a valuation story around a company, you essentially have publicly traded comparative companies that you can pretty much map to. And that's essentially how you're going to create your valuation profile. So if I'm again, it's an easy example here in the UK. If I'm a Manual or a Flow Health, I'm thinking about those publicly traded companies like a Hims, right? Or a Roe, or a Progeny, and
what, Dominick, could you explain a bit about what they do and how they compare with the comparators?
Yeah. Well, the key is really the fact that when you're publicly traded, I can go to sec.gov and pull up all of your financials, your quarterly report, your audited annual report, And then every bank in the world, when, these companies go to understand what their valuation is. So when they go to investors are essentially going to build a valuation around from those public comps, from private company transactions, and from the actual revenues and profile that they model from this company. And so that's really, so what they do is important, but it's more important that you have publicly available and audited data, financial data, that you can map a company to.
But for those of us who are not necessarily familiar with the brands, are those all sort of consumer focused or?
Yes. And if I was thinking about, so I mentioned kind of workflow companies earlier. There was a company that IPO'd last year called Waystar, for example. That's an example of maybe a revenue cycle management company that IPO'd. And that's probably why we think, or why we can assume that we have seen investments in those companies in the last year or two that have been doing very well in kind of the private space. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Gillian, impact is something that sometimes motivates investors, although I guess in my experience, it usually is an add-on on top of the economic return. I've yet to meet an impact investor who is prepared to substitute impact for some element of return. But to what extent does impact actually play a role in terms of the things that you decide to invest in?
Yes, you're right about impact, because if people are just looking for impact and they're not looking for return, I call that philanthropy. And I do philanthropic things, but with my angel hat on, I'm looking for something different. And yes, impact is definitely part of it, but it's not going to solve the problem on its own. In terms of my personal feelings around impact, I've taken a slightly, perhaps more controversial approach to it if I talk to some of the other angel investors. And that's informed by the fact that I spent 30 years in tech. I rarely saw anybody who looked like me at senior levels of the company. And when I finally, stuck my head above the parapet and had conversations with other females, I was pretty appalled to understand that it's not just that there aren't a lot of women in tech. There's also a very, very small amount of funding for women doing tech things. And I kind of took the approach that, yeah, I'm in the aggregate, I'm probably going to lose out on some of the opportunities by saying I'm not funding or investing in anything that doesn't have female founders with a significant portion of the equity at the early stages. So that is my foundation. I don't invest in anything that doesn't have females as part of the founding team. That's a core remit for me. And that's kind of where it started. And when you go down that path, you end up inevitably with a large number of the founders who are female or in teams that have females in them, who are looking for to solve social problems, to solve problems that have impact, or indeed problems that, reiterate for women more than men. I mean, part of the reason I'm an investor in Adora is I had a similar experience to Anne going through menopause and looked at it and thought, holy shit, if something like this had been around, maybe my path would have been easier. So, there's personal elements to that as well. But yeah, impact to me is about putting my money where my mouth is, having faith in women, having faith in their ability to deliver results and solutions. It's kind of interesting because when you dig into the numbers, it turns out that actually when women get money, quite often their returns in terms of their success rates of delivering returns are higher than the general statistical population out there for startups and founders. So I would actually argue that it's kind of a smart business decision to make as well for me. But I'm pragmatic about it. I know that, I'm not looking to blow the sky returns off. As Dominick has said, I'd be quite happily with, some very nice dragon exits. But I think in terms of impact, I understand that some of these problems are breaking markets in different ways. They're solving problems that haven't been focused on. They're going to need validation. They're going to need trials, particularly in anything that's health tech. I suppose I have a little bit of advantage in that spending 30 years in emerging technology, I understand that the life cycle from something emerging to something getting into the market and moving through is 5 to 7 years in most cases on the tech side, and that I went into this understanding that I was not likely to see returns for 10 plus years. And my ambition for my returns overall is probably 3 to 4x. It's not 100x. So I can afford to put some money into things that are driven by impact focus or social need focus, with an expectation that I'll get a return from the portfolio overall at a level that's acceptable to my goals. So yeah, impact's a funny word to use, and I think it means a lot of things to different people. So I've tried to define how I think about impact in that way.
Okay, thank you. And especially for Anne and Naomi, but also for the rest of us. We've gotten a question basically about sort of the difference between the UK and US markets. And, I have to say that in my experience, about 95% of the companies that I see in this space are ultimately see the US market as where they're going to make money. And some of that relates to the fact that the US healthcare market is completely screwed up and overpays. It's also a very large market, but some of it relates to the level of fragmentation in Europe in terms of different care pathways in different countries and the need to the issues associated with addressing that. But I guess starting, on Naomi, I think you indicated that sort of your first commercial sale has actually been into a U.S. hospital group. How are you approaching that, and where do you see kind of your core market opportunity?
Yeah, for Movetru, our core market is within the US. And for that, one, the only way to get to your market is to be there. So if the founder's not prepared to be there, it's probably not going to happen. So having to be out in the market, going out to the market and taking up opportunity was how we led to our first sale being there. And ultimately, there's a culture difference of the US wants to be the first. In the UK, it's what we usually hear is who else is using it and show me case studies. And in the US, it's been, oh my goodness, am I the first one to use this technology? That's really cool. And I think they understand the advantage of first mover. And yeah, they have bigger budgets to take higher risks. So for that reason, and also because of us being in sport, the sports market is also enormous as well for there, because sports is ultimately religion. That makes sense for us to be there in market. And I do think that there's just so many opportunities of being known as the person that isn't from there. Like whenever your accent is your tell that you aren't local, it is actually you are then known who's in the room. You'll be able to identify you faster. So I think it is actually an advantage that we can have and should use in terms of going into the market, because for us, our US traction has led on to a lot more UK traction in terms of customers.
And your employer focus, are you starting with UK employers, or what's your go-to-market strategy?
We're trying to, it's exactly it. It's with the UK employer market, but obviously we need a lot of global players. And there is, the good news is for all the investors, this is a global problem, and the UK are actually leading in terms of the conversation. So when I look at the news reports and the media coverage from the US, I think they're where we were 4 years ago. So the problem exists, and employers are willing to pay for it in the UK and the US. It's an easier one for us because it's English language, and that's obviously what Adora is for today. We have had the US in our sights from day one. We want to grow a global women's brand. We think we could be the number one in that in menopause. We understand women of this age and the anthropological piece around this as well, because I think health tech's not just a piece of software. You've got to be able to engage with the audience, and that's what we're proving in the UK. But to Naomi's point, it is a very different market, and we have been talking about how to launch there and how to test there, and we're very likely doing that with one of our clients who's just renewed, and so that's what we're looking at for this year. For us, it would be a state by state approach. So the things that we think about are: have we got the money? Have we got the runway? Can we afford not to be focused on the UK and growing the business here? We've recently started to work with other legal teams and finance teams who have got that experience, who have done this many times, and that for us is key. Having a very good network around us who can support us through.
I completely agree with that, and I think one of the things that I've seen is the importance of starting that network building very early, well in advance of going to the US, is getting those relationships, getting the relationship with key opinion leaders, and starting effectively to so that when you're ready to go, there's already a network there that is open to what you're doing and ready to support you. I'm going to slightly shift gears to one topic I want to be sure that we cover before the end, and that is what is when we diligence, and maybe I'll start with you, Gillian. When we diligence a business in this space, as opposed to what we might see in I don't know, ad tech or fintech or whatever, what are the differences? What are the extra things that we need for the founders to be able to show us, and how do we get comfortable? Anne referred to some of this, I think, a bit earlier, but I'd like to go into it a little bit in detail.
Yeah, there are definitely a few differences in terms of the pathway, I think. What that customer pathway looks like, and who and what do you need in terms of getting down it. So one of the things that Anne has talked about that resonates with me is the early stage and deciding in her case to go towards enterprise initially, because I think everybody knows that it's a really long haul to get these types of things into general practice medicine in the UK. So if you're starting off with that and you don't have a thought as to how you're going to get to early stage revenue, you're going to run out of money before you get the big players to go in. Now, that's not necessarily a unique issue. So, the background I have is when startups would come and talk to me in tech, I would be explaining to them, I don't care if you're working with Cisco or Juniper or whoever the flavor of the month is, Google. They're probably not going to be your first customer. And if you're relying on them for your first revenue, you're going to be banging your head against the door for a very long time. So big companies in general don't make fast decisions on spend. So that's it. And whether it's a public utility body like the NHS or whether it's a very large behemoth in industry, there's challenges there for your first road to market. So the pathway side of it and having an idea on pathway is really important. On Naomi's side, there's different issues there. So one of the things that impressed me early on was that she had thought about how she was going to get that validation without having to go through an NHS trial. So she went on the focus for the sports side. She went and thought consistently about how do I get the Loughboroughs of the world? How do I get the Manchester Metropolitans on? And how importantly am I going to fund those? Because those are expensive trials to run. So those are things that are kind of unique to this space. You need validation, you need certification, you need proof points, and you have to work out how you're going to get those from a mix of public and private bodies or university research things. And that's not always easy, especially for first-time founders, to get their heads around that there's a whole pathway that you have to navigate before you're actually going to get enough validation for anybody to attach credibility, because there's nothing attaches credibility faster to a solution than the third party. analysis and third-party reviews. So I do think that's something that the health tech space has, above and beyond all the issues with FCC regulation and, and drug trials and things for other areas. But even in the devices space, there still are pathways that are needed to be followed.
And that all comes down really to evidence-based support, which is, I think, where Anne was earlier.
That's a very good way of putting it, and a much less windy way is you need evidence-based support, absolutely.
And the thing which I find interesting in this space at the stage that we're at is we're not talking necessarily about a clinical trial. We're talking about some basis to believe, whether it's academic literature, whether it's a trial that's been done on 20 people, but something that shows some early indication that seems to be scientific, that the thing does what it says on the tin. Now, that actually plays into a question that we were just asked, which is, how do we deal with the question for people who do not have clinical backgrounds? And that's true certainly for most of our members. How do they assess that? I mean, Gillian, we faced that issue certainly in connection with Movetru. And there we had the benefit of both the two studies that you indicated, but also the ability to talk to people who were expert in the space and then report back on those conversations in the deal memo that we did. We also had IP support that was really critical in terms of being able to look at the patents and the issue whether there were competing IP claims, et cetera, that were going to get in the way. I think that is it's a fair question, and for me at least, the answer is the ability to talk to people as part of the diligence process who do understand the clinical issues. It would be, we have a new member, as it happens, who has a PhD in the life sciences space. And I think for some of what we might do going forward, the fact that she has joined us is going to be very helpful. But I think the best thing we can do is to talk to people. I'm going to ask Anne, in terms of your experience, what kind of diligence did you face, both from some of your early stage VCs, but also from your angel groups?
So I suppose just talking about that sort of the healthcare knowledge, we identified that gap. We did a gap analysis very, very early on. It was very important for us to surround ourselves by people who could help us and who could help us understand what an evidence roadmap would look like, what evidence we would need for different customers. But in terms of the talks with investors and angels, it's slightly different because they're slightly different groups and they were looking for different things. I wouldn't say that evidence was top of the list for either group, but certainly they wanted to understand the roadmap and the plan for how we were going to build evidence and what sort of evidence and how much that was going to cost, and definitely making sure we understood the cost of, say, a randomized controlled trial, which would be an ambition versus consumer or product usage or product testing. So we were always asked about it, but it wasn't necessarily expected at the early stage from us.
Okay, I guess we're nearing sort of the end. And so I think what would be useful if each of the panelists could really say, if there was kind of in one bullet point, the key things that one would need, what for you is the key element in terms of making an investment in this space. And since you're on the screen now, let's start with you.
I think the stage that I'm at, it's about the commercialization. Who is the payer? Have you built something that they're willing to pay for? I think that's a really important question to be asking in early stage, and what proof do they have of that? And that's certainly what I'm focused on this year.
Gillian.
I'd say that I don't look at this space in much of a different way from a diligence perspective than other spaces. And just if I reference back to the question, it's not all about clinical. There's an awful lot of, particularly in the areas I invest in, if you take it out of drugs and pharma, there's an awful lot of it that's technology that's coming in, and there are other pathways to get validity and reference check on that technology. So don't assume just because you don't know about health that you don't have skills or knowledge that are relevant to this space. And then I think after that, it's really about doing the diligence. As an angel investor, it always comes down to diligence in the team and in the ideas and in what their view of pathway to market is going to be.
Dominick.
Yeah, I think my single bullet I would wrap into what I like to call, founders have to be able to walk and chew gum, and so you have to do the very near term nitty gritty, but you also have to do those things that are going to set you up for the long term. And a good example is something you mentioned earlier, Bob, in terms of building your network in the States early. I think 80 to 90% of founders think that their companies can just show up and everyone is going to love them. And it just doesn't work that way. Whereas I spoke to a founder recently that's been going to JPM for 2 years in a row. They've been to the Consumer Electronics Show. They've been going to Davos, 2, 3 years in a row. Like that's networking, right? And so you can see that evidenced in, I think, a number of ways, but to do those things that you think you're not ready to do ahead of time, so that's what I mean by walk and chew gum.
Thank you. And Naomi.
I think it's showing having a diversity of investors because there is a massive strength to that. So if the company has brought in people with technical expertise that really understand it, but then also people who are experts in sport, experts in the sales market, experts in a variety of areas, I think that is one of the biggest strengths because the founding team can't do it on their own. And having a 5-minute conversation with someone that has been there and has that expertise, I think is the biggest accelerator for the company. So who's coming with the team, I think is also a really big strength that should be considered.
Okay, well, look, I have to say I agree with all of that. And I want to thank, first of all, the panelists for the discussion and also to thank all the participants who joined the webinar. If there are any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to hear them and to try to respond.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you again to everybody. So we're going to wrap up this evening.